What's going on, everyone? It's Justin here, back with the same hoodie, and today we're going to be comparing the MacBook Air M1 from 2020 to the brand new iPad Pro with an M1 processor. So I've got to say, this is a test that I'm very excited about because in the past we compared the MacBook Air versus the iPad, and we always talked about just how powerful the iPad is. So this is a comparison that I'm particularly very excited about because now more so than ever, it is an even playing field when it comes to the processor that is inside. In the past, the iPad has always been known for just how much optimized power that it was able to have in such a small form factor. But since Apple introduced their own silicone over to the computer line, as well as in the desktops, the Mac Mini, and also the iMac, it is crazy to see that the entire lineup from their desktop computer all the way to their portable tablet all shares the same internal processor. But even then, there are still some differences, and the experiences that you're going to get from the iPad and MacBook is going to differ depending on your tasks. So if you guys enjoy videos like this where I compare Apple products and check them out as soon as they come out, make sure you subscribe to the channel, drop a like on this video, and also leave a comment down below with which one you believe is best for your workflow. For starters, the models that I have in front of me is the MacBook Air 2020, and I went with the 16GB unified memory option. And on the iPad side, we have the top end 12.9-inch with Liquid Retina XDR display and also 16 gigs of unified M1 memory. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the display differences as well as the form factor, the software experience, and also some of the benefits that you might have when it comes to using a tablet over a laptop and vice versa. Port design is also another thing that I also really want to talk about because that is one area where the iPad has made a huge improvement. But when it comes to raw specs, I can tell you that whether you're doing like photo editing, a lot of productivity tasks, and even some video editing, both of these systems are going to be very good. So from my personal experiences, I've been between the iPad and the MacBook as kind of a portable machine for many years now. For the most part, I was a MacBook user. I liked the full software experience, but since I started traveling a lot, I brought the iPad around everywhere I went and essentially left the MacBook at home up until Apple announced the M1 processor option last year, and I've absolutely fallen in love with just how good the battery life is and just how powerful I'm able to run my everyday tasks with like the quick wake function, and I feel like it is essentially the perfect laptop for what I need, and I've got nothing but good things to say about this M1 processor. So the first thing I'm going to talk about here is the form factor and the display. The MacBook Air is super thin. It's obviously the smallest one in Apple's lineup, and overall, it is really easy to bring around. It has a nice tapered edge, but I have heard rumors that this year the updated MacBook Air is going to have more of a squared off design that also follows some of the similar characteristics of how the iPad is built. On the iPad side of things, you have a few ways that you can go ahead and use it. There is the option of just taking it around as a tablet and using the touch screen, but there's also the option to pick up a keyboard that has the exact same scissor switch that the MacBook has. Overall, when it comes to form factor, they're both super portable, so I don't think you can really base your decision off of that. But I do feel like the iPad is nice in the fact that I can detach the display and just set it aside if I don't want to take this entire folio keyboard with me. So moving on to the display, you can almost say the iPad has always had the best one in Apple's entire lineup. Not only is it 120 Hz with Pro Motion, but this year the iPad Pro 12.9-inch model has a Liquid Retina XDR screen, which is mini LED, meaning there is 10,000 individually lit pixels, as well as 2,500 local dimming zones, a full P3 color gamut. The iPad has a max brightness of 1,000 nits sustained and up to 1,600 nits in HDR. So pretty much the same brightness levels of the Pro Display XDR, which obviously costs a lot of money. On the other side of things though, the MacBook Air has never had like the best display in Apple's entire lineup. It has a 400 nits screen, and if you go with the Pro, it is 500 nits, but I really don't have any complaints from a productivity standpoint. But if you're really focused on like photo editing and want that great color accuracy and like the best display that Apple makes, then the iPad wins in this category. On the topic of accessories and prices though, the MacBook Air comes in at a price of $1,000. And if you're a student, you can get it for $899, and that comes with 8 gigs of unified memory. Whereas the iPad Pro 12.9-inch, if you want to measure the same form factor within that, has a starting price point of $1,099, which is $100 more than previous years. And the base models up to 512 gigs come with 8 gigabytes of unified memory, and it's not until you get to 1 to 2 terabytes that you get 16 gigs of unified memory. But by the time you add up the price with the keyboard, which I feel like like a lot of people who get the higher end iPad or the larger one are going to use, you start to go far above the starting price point of a full-fledged MacBook Air computer. And honestly, if you do pick up the Apple keyboard on the iPad, I feel like it is an incredible product. It works very well, it types nicely, and I know there's a lot of third-party options out there, but if you're used to a MacBook keyboard or have a desktop, then it feels right at home. But I will say the trackpad on the MacBook is just so much easier to use just due to its sheer size, but at the same time, the one on the iPad isn't too bad either. Before we move on to the next category though, I want to give a huge thanks to the sponsor of this video, Keeper Security, and their password manager. So that's something that I've used for quite a while now, and as you guys might know, we do switch between devices quite often. But whether you decide to get the MacBook or the iPad, one thing is you're going to have to set it up, and one of the most annoying things when setting up a brand new device is having to remember all of the passwords on the countless accounts for applications, social media networks, and you don't want to use the same password for everything because that is not secure, but at the same time, if you create a random password for each one, it is really easy to forget. So with the password manager, it enables you to store all of your passwords and just have one master passwords, and it keeps them safe. And when you want to go ahead and set up your brand new device or log into a new account, it is able to autofill it for you. Keeper Security is also able to create secure passwords for you and ensure that each of these accounts has a different one. And there is also a built-in security audit, so it will let you know which accounts that should need some attention in terms of a protection standpoint. This is something that I started using about a year ago, and I wish I started much earlier because I do switch between like laptops and tablets at least 2 to 3 times a year, and smartphones as well, and having to log into everything just kind of hurts the workflow, and the transition is just a little bit more annoying. If you guys want to go ahead and check it out for yourself, I've got a link down below, and a huge thanks to them once again for sponsoring this video. So when it comes to the hardware itself, I do feel like a lot of it is going to come down to preference. If you're used to a laptop form factor and want like a nice durable feel of like a unified system, then the MacBook is going to be the one that you should go with. But if you want one that is really good with multimedia and is very versatile, then the iPad with the detachable display is going to be the better option. But one area that the iPad has a huge edge over is the fact that you can also use the pen function. And I actually really like to use it, but I'm definitely not an artist. So for me, the pen option is not as important as it might be to someone else, but being able to take this with you and use this great screen with the ProMotion 120 Hertz and the very low latency allows you to create infinite amount of things, whether it is in Procreate, also do retouching, and the artistic side of the iPad is what has really been its competitive edge paired with its power for many, many years, and is still the reason why the iPad is literally the best tablet on the market, whether you like Apple products or not. The pen itself hasn't really changed though, but with the introduction of the M1 processor to the iPad and the fact that it is 50% more powerful in the CPU and 40% more powerful in the GPU makes it a very compelling option once again for creatives, because just from my raw tests of like photo edits and also applying corrections to multiple photos at a time and the import, those numbers and the benchmarks that are given at the 40 and 50% improvements are definitely noticeable on this iPad. It isn't just something that is numbers on a screen. I personally think it's just crazy that this iPad at this size uses the same processor as Apple's 24-inch iMac desktop. So when it comes to the ports, both of them are relatively limited, but it isn't really a knock on the product itself. It is just something that is a pretty obvious observation. On the MacBook, you have 2 Thunderbolt ports, and one of them is going to be used for charging most likely, and the other for plugging in storage, whereas the iPad features 1 port altogether, and if you have the keyboard case, it gives you a second one. If you want to charge your iPad while you're using it, you can plug it into the keyboard, but it does charge it at a much slower speed. But this year, they also introduced Thunderbolt 3 and USB 4 to the iPad, which really does change things because file transfers are pretty much 2 times faster. And from a real world test, we definitely noticed when comparing it to the 2020 iPad Pro. That allows you to connect a dock as well as gigabit Ethernet, but I think the biggest benefits is if you're transferring like 50, 100, or even hundreds of photos, it is going to cut your import time down in half. One thing I will say though is that the battery drain is faster with the keyboard. And even while keeping it plugged in, if I was running really intensive tasks on the iPad, I did find that the iPad often drained a little bit faster than it was able to charge at. And as I mentioned, that is expected because it is kind of a pass-through charging system on this tablet. One other thing to also keep in mind though is that the webcam on the iPad is significantly better than the one on the MacBook Air. On the MacBook you have a 720p that hasn't really been updated in many years, and I do imagine that this year we're going to see 1080p across the entire Apple lineup. But on the iPad, not only does it have a much better image quality, but it now also has a functionality where if you're in like a FaceTime or conference call, it has a super wide camera and is able to actually track your face through machine learning and keep you in frame at all times. So say you're in the boardroom and just walking around and giving an explanation, or you're like a realtor and trying to show a place around and demonstrate certain things, or maybe even making like a cooking tutorial and are moving around the kitchen, it is able to keep you in frame, and I feel like that is a really nice new feature. So here's a look at a camera comparison between last year's iPad Pro and this year's iPad Pro with M1 chip. And I think the front-facing camera is where there is the biggest improvement overall. The previous one has a 7 megapixel sensor, whereas the new generation has a 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera. And through the machine learning and FaceTime, I actually just tested it out a couple minutes ago. It was able to actually track me all around the room. I was walking back and forth and just really trying to put it through spaces, because I know a lot of times with like machine learning stuff, it doesn't work that well, but it was able to do a great job in keeping me in the center frame. And I just find that this is actually a really nice practical feature. So yeah, let me know if you guys can notice a difference in the camera quality of the previous and current generation iPad Pro. For those who are wondering if there's a huge difference in terms of the display quality of the iPad Pro 2021 and it's all like mini LED technology compared to the previous generation, what I've got to say about that is that the previous generation display was already excellent. I didn't have any complaints about it, but I do know mini LED is the future, and especially if you're in like a bright situation or out in a cafe, the iPad is going to have a huge edge compared to the MacBook just due to its sheer brightness and the nits count, which once again is 400 versus 1000 sustained. The other thing that the iPad also brings is a camera setup on the back that also features a LiDAR sensor. And if you're in the industry of AR or VR and can utilize these tools, the iPad is going to be a no-brainer. Being the same amount of power as a very good computer on a tablet that has LiDAR capabilities and applications that are made to utilize that technology and make old-fashioned technology that is usually very inaccessible in that field, something that you can do from the palm of your hand, is also huge. And even though I am not in that industry, I imagine it is a huge factor for a lot of people out there. And the LiDAR and camera setup category is just one of those areas where there isn't really a comparison here. When it comes to sound though, the iPad and the MacBook both focus on it very well in various ways. The MacBook has made huge improvements over the years when it comes to speaker quality, and even though the MacBook Air is a relatively small one, it may not have the same level of speakers that you'd find on a 13 or 16-inch Pro, it is really good. And I also find that on the iPad Air, with the speakers all over the place and the microphone improvements that they've also made over the years, both of which are very powerful tools for multimedia and also conference calls. So here's a quick sound test of both the microphone and the speaker quality on the iPad and the MacBook. So now on the topic of battery life, I can say that the MacBook Air has made a huge improvement since the introduction of the M1 processor. I've literally been able to get to 2 or even 3 days of usage in one go, and that is something that I've never been able to get on a computer that I use on an everyday basis. So that is great to see. But over on the iPad side, I find that especially with the keyboard, if I want to get a similar experience to the laptop, the battery typically lasts just about a day, maybe a little bit more, but I do notice that it is significantly worse when plugged into the keyboard. If you weren't going to have the keyboard on it, the battery life should get you around the same as what I'm able to get on the MacBook, but from my observations, I think the MacBook especially, if you're skeptical, has made a huge improvement when it comes to screen on time and also standby time. The iPad runs iPadOS, which has made different improvements to give it more of a desktop-like experience and how it syncs with macOS, whereas macOS is one where I feel like they've added a few things that have tied it in more towards the mobile experience, more so than it has become more of a complicated system. I feel like Apple has really simplified macOS to kind of bridge that system. But at the same time, one of the things that everyone's been talking about is when is the iPad really going to get a true desktop experience that is also touch intuitive? And I don't really know what to say about that, but I do hope they do it because now with the M1 processor, I feel like that is a huge hint just based on the capability that you can have with this tablet. I do think that they're going to do it eventually, but I wouldn't say the iPad is really a laptop replacement just because the file system is one that is still not very easy to use. One thing that I really like about using an iPad though is that I feel like the apps are just very well optimized. They kind of have like a hybrid experience to them and they give you all the desktop functionality now that the power is very capable, but at the same time, it feels simplified, it runs well and everything, and I do like being able to use the pen function and touchscreen when I want to because it just feels intuitive. It's like human nature to be able to touch and feel and control things. So personally, I find that the iPad is one that I'm really able to focus on one task at a time, whereas my computer is one where I just want to like have a ton of things open and just get like the raw work done, but it does get really busy, and I feel like it's a different type of usage experience. So I don't really know what you guys like and based on your personal preference, but I do still feel like I have to have a laptop at all times, but if I really want to just like do some notes and focus on one thing, I'll go over to the tablet. And when it comes to multimedia, I prefer the iPad every day of the week. I don't know, feel like it's something that is made more for that versus bringing a MacBook on a plane and opening it up and watching movies that way. With the M1 processor and also the 40% improvement in graphics though, and the Thunderbolt 3, this iPad can actually plug into a display, a 6K display, and fully run that. So if you want to plug it into your Pro Display XDR and just like be able to draw and see it on a big screen, you can do that. And I do feel like that is huge, but at the same time, you only have that one port. So, I mean, you could connect stuff to your XDR, but I also don't see that many people buying a Pro Display XDR to use their iPad with. But nevertheless, that just goes to show the amount of power and versatility you do have with this touch intuitive system. So now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the raw benchmarks on how the MacBook Air with 16 gigabytes of M1 unified memory is able to compare to the brand new iPad Pro 13-inch with 16 gigabytes of M1 as well. Even though they both have the same processor and the same amount of memory, they are going to give different scores because the thermals of the MacBook do give it a little bit more room to breathe despite not having a fan, whereas the iPad deals with the processor a little bit differently. For the iPad though, you're coming from a 6GB RAM over to 16, so if you're coming from a previous generation iPad, even though the design is pretty much the same, you should expect a pretty big difference in performance. So the first test that we ran was Geekbench, and this is more so to let you compare it to your current generation product as opposed to comparing the iPad to the MacBook because the score is pretty much the same. Both the iPad and MacBook came out with a score of around 1700 in the single core, whereas the MacBook Air came out with a little bit of a higher score of 7600 in the multi-core compared to 7586. When it came to testing graphics, we used 3D Mark and the Wildlife Benchmark graphics test, and on the MacBook Air we got a score of 4901 and an average frame rate of 29.3 seconds, whereas on the iPad Pro 2021 we got 4990 for the overall score and 29.9 in the average frame rate, which is once again pretty much exactly the same. Moving on to some of the more practical benchmarks though, I wanted to test how fast it was to transfer 50 images into Lightroom. As we know, the iPad Pro 2021 does have Thunderbolt support, but it does also depend on the speed of storage inside. So when it came to this test, the iPad was able to transfer images in about 24 seconds, which was actually 2 times faster than what we saw on the previous generation, and it took just about 16 seconds to paste all the settings onto all 50 images. The MacBook Air on the other hand was able to transfer in just 6 seconds and was able to complete the paste settings to 50 images in under 10 seconds. I also did go ahead and run an export test on the iPad and also the MacBook, and I was using iMovie on the iPad because it is native Apple software, and Final Cut Pro 10 on the MacBook Air. One thing I will say though is that the iPad doesn't really support ProRes that well, which is kind of strange because it is Apple's native software, but in the same video that was a 4K 3-minute clip, the iPad Pro took just about 1 minute and 40 seconds, whereas the MacBook Air was able to do it in just under a minute. Beyond the whole export thing though, even though you can edit videos very nicely with like LumaFusion, which is the most popular app in my opinion for the iPad, I really don't find it to be a very practical or enjoyable experience because the file system and everything is different, and I just feel like the iPad is not exactly made for this type of creative work. As for the raw boot up time though, the M1 MacBook Air and the iPad Pro was right around a second apart at around 13 seconds to turn on. So at the end of the day, what is my conclusion of the M1 battle of the MacBook and the iPad? And I've got to say, I'm really impressed by the iPad, and when the MacBook M1 came out, I had already bought the 2020 MacBook with an i7 processor. When I tested it out, it was so good that I sold my computer at a loss and went and bought a brand new one 6 months after I just picked up a brand new MacBook Air. And I can say that it's become one of my favorite Apple products of all time, just because it works. It has fixed all the problems of the past, but I wouldn't say it really gave me like a wow factor because it is the same design as before, and we do expect a redesign sometime soon. But if anybody was to come to me right now and ask me which MacBook to buy, it's gonna be the MacBook Air, and I feel like it's just something that I can't really find anything wrong with, aside from maybe having an additional port on this side, like a Thunderbolt, because I do seem to run out. On the iPad side of things though, I am super impressed. I never thought that I would see an M1 processor inside of a tablet computer and have like this whole unified lineup. I think I said a few years back that Apple should really tie the whole lineup together. And who knows, maybe eventually we'll see M1 in an iPhone or like a mobile version, but the fact that this tablet has the same amount of power as the desktop, is able to do video editing and photo editing, it is able to transfer really fast through Thunderbolt 3, plug it into a 6K display while also giving you the pen functionality. I do feel like this could be a laptop replacement for some people, but personally, I don't use the artistic tools and the benefits of the iPad enough, including like the camera, the LiDAR, and all that stuff, to really replace it as my daily computer. But I do still plan to get one, and I do plan to use this quite often. But if your field utilizes the technology from this iPad, then this is going to be an absolute dream. Now that you have so much power paired up with the hardware, the LiDAR, the camera, and all that all in one system. So I hope this video was helpful for some of you. If you guys enjoyed it, make sure you drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know what other videos you want to see, and I'll see you all in the next one.